to talk about your memoir, Country Girl, which we'll publish in October this year. It's been well documented that you've led quite an extraordinary life, but for some time I think you said you wouldn't write this book. What changed your mind?
You'll be very disappointed with the reply. My livelihood changed my mind. I had written Saints and Sinners as were my stories. Anyhow, I'd written novel after novel after novel, and I felt I had nothing in me. There was no seed or seedling. And I was with Ed Victor, my agent, and I said, I'm finished. I'm finished. And he said, no, you're not. You're going to write your memoir. And I said, I don't want to. It's too naked, or naked making. He said, why don't you think about it as something that you'll actually enjoy writing, big phrase, and that things you want to say about yourself that perhaps nobody else could or would do. They wouldn't be as honest. And coming home in a taxi, I had always carry sheets of paper, this is called Hope Eternal, and a pen, and I began to write it, and I wrote the prologue. So that was how it came about, and in the 3 years of the doing, I have sometimes wished I wasn't doing it. The beginning was easier, you see. You know, there was this groundswell of stuff that I knew I could draw on. But having to relive, and relive as intensely as when it was happening, certain moments, or times, not moments, in my life, it brought a lot of pain. It also brought a lot of anger in me, bubbling up, because I thought, why wasn't I braver? Why didn't I stand up to people? Why did I allow myself to be subordinate when I have some, I hope, intelligence? So a lot of different emotions and variations happened to me in the writing, and sometimes, like just to say in parenthesis, sometimes I loved doing it. And surprisingly enough, and this is not said to entice the reader to read all 300 and whatever number of pages they are, the last chapter, which is both actual and dreamlike, the last chapter, and maybe it was because I was getting to the last chapter, made me very happy to write, because I was trying to summon up what it is to hold on to the actuality of coming from a country and yet never going back to it, or going back to it but only in a temporary way, and to recognize at last the wedding or the coming together of the country of Ireland and the country of England in me. And it said the two countries, because I did meet, in fact, a woman on a road. And she recalled to me how she used to see me around Chelsea and how glamorous I seemed to her. And she also recalled Ireland and the area called the Burn, where the gentians spring up as if by the hand of God between these slabs of limestone. There's no earth, and yet these little gentians come, there must be earth. She recalled all that and the blue of it, and I entered into her recalling it. And I had just seen Werner Herzog's Caves of Forgotten Dreams. And I realized as she was talking, she said, but we live here now. And I said, in life we do. And then in the book I say, and the two countries had sparred and warred and fought inside me, like the two halves of my warring self. So that it was both a personal and a little impersonal or geographic discovery. And then coming in to this room, in fact, where it says, and the red lamp, you know, put on the lights, including the red lamp, and waiting for a last banquet. And that banquet could be another book, another love, or one's death. It's a question that is open. It's not, I hope, It may be sad, but I hope not depressing.
Let's talk a little bit about the early years, your life growing up in rural Ireland, moving to Dublin, training as a pharmacist, and discovering love and literature, and love for literature.
In tandem.
Exactly. And how you went about, it's an extraordinary thing, how you went about recreating faithfully that time on the page.
I tried to make each chapter, in a sense, as if it were fiction, a story in itself. It's a very interesting thing about memory. It's like a tap, or it's like tapping a tree for rubber. Once you start tapping the old cells, it comes. And I was in New York for publication of my short stories about 1 year ago now. And I was walking down a street and I suddenly had all this impulse to write about, there's a section in it called Summer Holidays. And it begins by saying something like, I go around the kitchen in my grandmother's house. And it is like in a little ghost walk, really, of a child. But there it came to me in the middle of Manhattan on a boiling day, and I went to a cafeteria and I asked them for paper, and they brought tiny little, like what you write bills on. And I was fluent in it. I mention it because, and many writers would identify, I think, with it. It's one of the mysterious, freak ways that writing comes to one. What I didn't want to do was to sit down methodically and say, I will now, although it starts with two dreams, as you know, and then it starts with the birth. But the reason for the birth is not simply about my birth, it is our house. And our house, going to use a very big, probably phony word now, our house to me then and forever is like a metaphor for the whole world. It was a house in which there was ructions and the smells of cake, and there were sensual things, there were frightening things, there were prayers, there were curses, there was doom, and there was life, which life itself is. So I wanted, while giving it some sense of a sequence of time, to do that. So in our house, when I was writing it, and all the rooms and the bedspreads and the dust under the floor, under the bed, and putting a mop in under it and trying to get the dust, little whirls of dust out, and a blind that never came down properly. It's a beautiful feeling, actually. It's like a whole influx of something that is stronger than memory. Of course it's memory, but you're back in it. You're not writing it second hand. Again, that accounts for a certain derangement. I do not call myself sane.
And the men in the book at this time are extraordinarily predatory as well.
I was afraid of my actual father, and I think that comes out. But then the counterpart to that, which was a great and beautiful gift from God for me to have, was our workman. And he was named Carnero, and he was, as I put it, disinclined to wash or anything. And he was quite heavy, and he ate a lot. He loved food, and he put jam and butter and everything on the bread. My mother wasn't looking. She was very generous, but she didn't think he needed the bread buttered both sides. And he inculcated in me, otherwise I would hate men utterly, and I only half hate men, the way I only half hate women. He inculcated in me the love of what it is to love a man. If I had just known my father, who was a fearful figure to me, he was probably far less fearful than I thought. But when you are young and somebody is very tall and shouting and so on, you are afraid. I mean, my mother was afraid. Later on in her life, she was not afraid of her husband, and they had a very good mediation later on in life when he stopped drinking. But the men in the village en masse were they seemed figures of authority, even if they were just selling cattle in the fair. The priests were figures of authority, definitely. And they were in many ways, and it's true, not just from my experience, but for that time in Ireland and in that parish, they were very separate from the women. I never saw my mother and father, they never went to a shop together, or they never went to Mass together, or sat next to each other. Never. No wife did. No wife. Not just... And at Mass, the men stood at the back of the chapel, and the women were all praying, raising their eyes to heaven. So my first, what shall we call it, experience of men is a very divided one. There's sort of love or attraction in it, or burgeoning love and attraction, and there's fear.
A fear, yeah. So into this you've talked a lot about Ireland at the time, and there's a certain culture of fear and oppression, and of course you landed a bomb in the middle of this, really, in 1960 with the publication of your first novel.
Yeah, I didn't think so, but they did.
They certainly did, yeah.
I thought, this is just a little book, really, about two girls and their coinciding, their opposing dreams. One wants to be a poet and one wants to marry a rich man. It did cause a lot of trouble, in fact, tremendous ructions. And the two authors in Dublin who were very eminent at that time were extremely envious of it. Miles Nagopolin and Patrick Kavanagh, it seems, wrote some poem, because they thought to be banned is really a hot ticket to fame and to recognition. And the reason it caused such hubbub was, I think, this. There had been two women writers, Kate O'Brien and Elizabeth Bowen. Elizabeth Bowen was Anglo-Irish or Protestant, and she was therefore on a higher echelon. And Kate O'Brien moved to Spain, where she wrote. And her novels, they are good to read now, they are, but they didn't touch the nerve or offend the sensibility of the people. Not deliberately, because I thought at the time, and still think, that The Country Girls is a little elegy. It's a little love song to my native land. I really think that. I don't think it's running them down or belittling them or betraying them, but they all thought it was.
Yeah.
And because it's written in the first person and has the immediacy of a diary, while not being a diary, it sort of made people feel this is our lives. She has written, so many people, they think their character, all of them couldn't be the same character. You know what I mean? They hated it, but they also threw themselves into it by identifying with it. And then there was the supposed intention of ridiculing priests and nuns. In fact, what has now come out about the iniquities and cruelties of priests and nuns was something far greater than I touched on in my little way. But at that time, the sense, I remember after it came out, and I was back home, and there was an awful lot of brouhaha, and my mother was mortified, and I was mortified because my mother was mortified with me, and I'd given her the book, but I never saw it. And after her death, I found it with all the wrong, offending words, as I think I once told you, inked out.
Yeah.
But there was also in the village, and people, would draw back behind their window curtain. They'd look out if I went up the street, and as if I was a Jezebel. Uh-huh. And I was very glad not to be living there, or not to be living in Dublin, because I might not have had the inner strength to start the next novel and the next and the next. Exile and separation was very, very good for me and very essential.
So around this time in your life, there were a lot of dramatic changes. You fall in love, you get married, you move to London, you have 2 children, the marriage fails, and then there are a lot of parties in the book. There's a wonderful chapter, or even 2 chapters, at the heart of the book, where you describe these remarkable parties. It couldn't be any more different from Ireland in the sepia 30s, this idea of London in the swinging 60s,
yes,
is brought to life beautifully.
I was mad for life. And I thought, mistakenly, Lee, that parties were the ticket to life. I forgot that I'd end up broke. One part of my childhood was poor. We were run out of money. But another part of my childhood, in things I read, were very much to do with feasts. They were regal kingly or queenly feast. You know, I am Macleog and my home is on the lake. Thither often to that palace from whence beauty is fled, came Brian to ask me, and I went for his sake. So the mythology and the poetry and my own little inner dreams and concoctions of mythology and poetry were that feasts, and that's why the last word in my memoir is the word banquet, that feasts were like the marriage feast of Cana. The word was in me as that a feast could only be an occasion of happiness. So I come to London, I am married and living in SW20 and taking a bus to get a bus, and life was very punitive in every way and Spartan. So I then leave that marriage rather like, well, actually not as brave as Nora in Ibsen's Doll's House, because at least Nora makes a statement by saying she will be true to herself. I left in what is unfortunately called a big hurry, without anything in my pocket, and I didn't even know if I was going to be true to myself. I knew I had to leave. And then I wrote 2 books, Girls with Their Married Bliss, which was the third of the trilogy, and another book which created a lot of rumpus, August is a Wicked Month. And I got quite a bit of money for August is a Wicked Month, so now I could have the parties. How I came to know all the people who came to the parties, to this day, baffles me myself. It was like a chain letter, like I invite you, you invite him, he invites him. It was the 60s as well. People would say, I went to parties, I didn't know the people to whose house I was going. But my house became a fixture, partly because it was every Saturday night. And also it had a little bit of romance by being on the river, and Deodar Road was ingrained now in the party-going populace of London. And I loved it, and yet I knew that, not that I was wasting my time, but that I would have been better advised to have been a little more sensible. I realise, and it's in the moment when going up on a Monday morning to write again, each morning, the parties were Saturday, but the clearing up was Sunday, and realising that, again, the schizophrenia of myself, or the division within myself, that really, where was my true self? Up in the top of the house those Monday mornings when I was writing about rain and wind and home and passions and thwarted passion and loneliness, which I think loneliness is so ingrained in me that I am always lonely, even at a party, even when I was giving them. I was busy, but I was lonely. It's a different matter. And the chapter ends, which has not annoyed some people, but has taken them by surprise, in which I have a dream. There's about 6 dreams in my book that were significant to me. I have the dream was, I have the party, it's my kitchen, it's the same kitchen, only there are features in it that are a little strange, a little unnerving, as they might be in a hospital kitchen. Bells, sense of danger. And on the huge stove, again a much bigger one, are pans of boiling water and boiling fat, goose fat, bubbling. And I pick up these pans as in a Buñuel film. I love Buñuel, Exterminating Angel and those films. And I throw these boiling cauldrons at guests who are utterly surprised. And that's where the parties ended.
Yeah.
The parties ended both in life and in dream by my realizing, this is not what I want. This is not what I want. I want to write. I want to keep writing. I want to write better. I want to have to be a hermit if I'm going to write. And then what I did, as you know from the sequence of the book, instead of getting all my sanity and my faculties together, I voluntarily, I asked for it, underwent a trip with Orly Lang one morning in May the 6th, 1970. And it was indeed a long trip, like You know those lines at the beginning of T.S. Eliot's The Journey of the Major, in which he describes the long journey and how hard it was. The LSD trip was disturbing beyond words, radical, I would say, mentally radical. And I would also say it was a turning point in my inner life, which then ultimately becomes my writing life. I think it deepened, or I hope, but I think it did, and I hope it doesn't sound self-important. It deepened my already dark self, and it deepened my writing, because under the influence, and the many hours, and then the many months, if not to say years, that followed after it, and not just the recurring trips, but what they brought up. That made for a shockingness, but also ultimately a gravity. So I'm glad I did it, but I also know that it is something I wouldn't recommend my own children to have.
Sure.
Because nobody knows the particular lineament and nature of your inner brain and mind, or whichever mind we shall call it. You don't know until you take it whether you're going to see, the golden acorns, or whether you're going to have the gaping womb of hell that you have to step into. You don't know it till you take it. And therefore that is why it is a great risk. I have often said, rather insultingly perhaps, that I think a lot of bankers should be given LSD. It would improve them perhaps, make them a little more honest.
The book documents a time that was inhabited by really titanic literary figures, most of them male, Norman Mailer, Philip Roth, Ted Hughes, Beckett, all appear in the book. What was it like as a woman, making your way as a writer in this world dominated by men?
What is very hard is to be taken as seriously as a man. History is to blame or accountable for it. Many things are to blame. It is also true that men, you're excluded from this criticism, men for the most part give they approach a work, whether it's fiction or poetry, whatever, by a man with a different attitude to that if the author is female. There's no doubt about it. That is true. And it is a condition to. Not only are men conditioned to, but so are women. Women have been as hard on me as actually in criticism and in reviews and all that. In fact, maybe even harder than men. So it is unfair, but you know what? It's part of life. And eventually what counts is the dedication, the absolute fanatic determination, and I suppose love that one puts into a work. Rilke said true something, true love, true wisdom, and he used some other marvelous word, that's what the writer needs. The writer needs that. That's your mantra. And the other things, whether men get more praise or more prizes, which is absolutely the truth, they do, than women, you know what? There it is, you can't help it. It mustn't deter one or embitter one or make one more insecure. Because in the end, what counts are those sentences. Do they stand up? And what way do they stand up? And what luster are there? And what power are there? And what permanence are there? Now, all that sounds rather lofty, and you may say to me, well, did you, when you were young, have those thoughts? I did not. I wrote The Country Girls, hoping, a little book. I hope I wouldn't get into hot water. By the way, with my memoir, I hope I won't get into hot water, but I'm always getting into hot water. It's unavoidable for me. But because I have read so, as you see from here and another room, the same upstairs, I have read so deeply and so utterly and so religiously all my life. I know that I have improved myself. I have improved myself. I am studious, despite the parties. But I also know that the ignorance, the state of ignorance and the state of innocence, both are true, that I was in when I wrote my first book, The Country Girls, was a blessing of another kind. I could never write a book like that again. There's too much in my mind now, too much stuff. I've gone off message, but you could steer me back, Lee.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. I think you've written a book that's equally as powerful, if not more powerful, than your debut. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you for your time.
That's okay.
Thank you all. Thank you all.